Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos y Reyes. Our special guest is Jeffrey Stuart. Mr. Stuart has served as a delegate in writing the new platform of the American Solidarity Party, and he was very involved in the drafting of the foreign policy plank. And that will be our focus today. But we begin, as always, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right, and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Jeffrey, I wonder if you couldn't, first of all, tell us a little bit about the process of becoming a delegate for the convention, which was just a few weeks ago, and then tell us a bit about the actual process in drafting this plank of the platform.
Sure. The process for becoming a delegate was, the party had some elections a while ago. We did regional elections to elect delegates from each region. And I believe it's sort of a north-south. I can't remember. There's a western, and I can't remember all of the actual divisions for the delegates. But I'm one of the part of the southern region. I now live in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that was pretty straightforward. Once the delegates were selected, there was the organization of the teams to begin work, and we really did go through sort of the Tuckman's stages of group development, the forming, storming, norming, and performing. We did go through all of those stages. The early work was a lot of good-natured and sincere butting of heads on how to get the work done, which is to be expected. Everyone sort of has their idea to do it, on how to do it. And I'll be honest, there's often jockeying going about to sort of different delegates to kind of push what they believe is most important. And that's not unusual. I don't say that in a negative way. I think that any sort of body where you're bringing together elected delegates, that's going to be normal. We all have our agendas that we come to the table with. And I'm certainly one of those guys. I had some things that I wanted to see get done. But it did sort of stall. And for a while, there was a little bit of no activity. But then the teams started to self-form, which I think is always the best way to get things done. And groups started to center around the different topic areas that you have in the platform now. And one of those was, of course, foreign policy. And the team that really centered around that was myself. Schuyler was actually the chief scribe and did most of the writing. Eric Anton, Dave Bovey, and I believe, I'm leaving some folks out too. I know that Dane Garrett was involved some with that, but Deb, I think, probably had his hand in that a little bit as well. And I'm probably forgetting some folks. But that was the major group. We really, to do our work, we had Schuyler, like I said, was the scribe. Schuyler put stuff on paper, and then the team would all take shots at it. We'd all get out our guns, shoot holes in it, give ideas where we think it needed to be improved. And in terms of working groups that I have worked with, both professionally or in any capacity, I thought this group worked very well together. There was no hurt feelings about disagreement or giving constructive criticism, that the group really worked well together. And I think because of that, we were able to produce a foreign policy section where the party really had none before that I'm really happy with, and I think we as a party should be happy with. I think it strikes a good balance between trying to push for lack of a better term, an anti-war agenda. I'll be happy to say a non-interventionist agenda, but also realizing that we can't just cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. That also is not an option. And so that's it in a nutshell.
How about, and that's very helpful, how about if I just read the first paragraph? We could call it the preamble of the plank. And then perhaps you and Mario could both respond to that, and then we could look at the particular points. So the preamble of the plank reads as follows. The American Solidarity Party is committed to policies which will bring about a more peaceful world through international cooperation and prudent restraint in the use of military force. Peace is not just an absence of war, but the positive presence of justice and charity among people and among nations. The United States should use its diplomatic influence and soft power to promote an international order that respects the dignity of the human person. Administrations of both parties have pursued a policy of reckless overreach at great cost to both ourselves and other nations. Through its military, political, and economic interventions, the United States has exacerbated social and environmental instability in Latin America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. In the place of this tired elite consensus, we need a foreign policy with both a realistic appreciation of our country's interests and a steadfast adherence to its values. So that's the lead paragraph. Mario, does that sound like a good way to get started?
I think so. I think it's very very explicit, and yet what I see there is just a set of policies in the broader sense. In other words, it's showing how the party will deal with some international issues based on cooperation and restraint. But I have a question for Jeffrey, even more concrete than that. If that is the proposal in general terms, what was the analysis about the world that led the delegate to propose this broad view of foreign policy?
Well, I can certainly only concretely speak to my view of the world, but I think you'll find, in varying degrees, some agreement with some of the things I'm going to say. And I will also say my perspective is that of I am a retired naval officer. I have plenty of sand in my boots from all of the places in the world that we've been involved in the last 20 years. And I went and I followed my orders and I carried out my duty. I often feel that in terms of foreign policy, because the military is actually so very good at our primary job, which is to be a military force that, the old cliche is to break things and destroy, and that is what we do. That has become a bit of the easy button answer for our politicians, that whenever there's a problem, it's just get the bat out, because the bat works real well, at least seemingly works well, at doing what the bat does. But the problem is we leave a big mess after that, and the more we use the bat to solve our problems, the deeper we get into that mess. And it seems like those messes then cause us to use the bat even more, and it's a death spiral. We're stuck in a bad spot, and we're stuck in spots where the answer to get out, on one hand, you'll have a faction will say, we just need to drop everything and leave now, and I understand that. And then you have a faction that will say, no, we got to stay for the long haul, and we got to continue what we're doing. It's a dangerous world. And I think our group was one saying that we're not going to be able to get out of this overnight, but we need to have a tendency towards not using the military for everything. And that's going to be a little bit of a painful withdrawal, and it's going to take some time. But that's the trajectory we believe we need to be on to not only reassert some goodness that the United States can provide the world, but also just internally so we can take care of some of our own problems as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I certainly try to.
Yes, my point is that if we begin looking at the world from the perspective of a post-world or post-Soviet Union collapse, so it seems that one of the options was seeing the United States as the only superpower. Now, after many years, that view seems to be changing because the merging of other powers. So perhaps we are witnessing right now the end of bipolarity, and so we began again to try to build some alliances here and there. That seems to be what is happening in the world with the emerging power of China and in Europe as well. Now, having said that, if we go issue by issue, let's say that we need to deal with protection of human rights in a foreign land, which is close to American influence, so to speak. Let's say that we need to protect human rights in some country in Latin America. And we don't want to intervene. We don't want to use military power. So what would be the best choice for this platform, for the American Solidarity Party, in order somehow to convey people that there are certain rights that should be protected?
We might take Venezuela as a test case.
Well, I could certainly, in a general sense, let me address one point you made, and then I'll get to your question. I think that perhaps the notion the United States as the quote only superpower was a misnomer to begin with. Yes, I will stress again, in terms of our military capability, we have no peer in this world. We can break down an opposing force like nobody's business very quickly, and in fact, usually the battles and the war are over before the enemy even knows they started. We are that good, but that's only part of it. And so the notion of I'm going to be this superpower and I'm going to be able to just throw my weight around, that only goes so far. And what I sometimes point out to folks is that the resistance you get from these folks, or from the quote opposition, you shouldn't be surprised that they don't acknowledge that they quote lost, because we wouldn't either. And if it was if the situation was flipped around, and let's just say I'm here in my city of Norfolk, or I'm in my ancestral lands up in the Appalachians, which I think is a very fitting place to talk about this, and I'm getting bombed by the air, and I have opposing forces coming in. I'm not giving up. I mean, that's just not my nature. I'm going to fight. I'm going to continue to fight. I'm going to fight any way I can, and I'm going to fight, make it long and protracted. And at the end of the day, I don't have to beat you. I just have to make it so you want to give up. And we've already demonstrated that we were willing to do that somewhat in Korea. We've demonstrated we were willing to do that in Vietnam. And we demonstrated that we were willing to do that in Iraq. That as long as the enemy makes it just so painful that we lose interest, that we will walk away. That's all they have to do. Now, to your bigger question about human rights and being able to take action when we need to take action, we never seem to have the proper discussion to go down that road. And let me say from the start, I can understand the plight of, just you could pick any country. I mean, the arguments were used were used in Iraq that Saddam was massacring his people. He was a tyrant. violating their human rights? Absolutely he will. And I would want to put an end to that if I could. I just don't think we have the ability to do that on our own, given everything else I've talked about. I think that we overestimate our ability to affect change on such a scale. And so if the global community, especially if it's going to be regional, feels that some of these things are an issue, and I think more of our attention should be helping our actual real neighbors rather than going gallivanting all over the world, it needs to be a regional solution, and it can't be the U.S. is a superpower and we're obliged to help. It needs to be the U.S. is there with every other nation who can bring a hand to bear. And, sad to say, if there's no agreement there, I don't think we should be acting alone because, quite honestly, the track record shows that we're not capable of doing it without making a mess, and that should be no surprise. And so my heart goes out to those situations, but unless we have the resolve and we have a backing of everybody else in the area, and I shouldn't say like it has to be unanimous, but we have a good coalition, then we can't act. And that would be sort of my general answer to that question.
Let me look at one of the bullet points, as we call them, in the plank. And it will take us back to your point, Jeffrey, that sometimes after the bat has broken things and there doesn't appear to be a way of putting things back together, nonetheless there has to be a gradualism in moving our forces out of a given area. For those of you who have the document at hand, this would be 5 bullet points down, and it reads as follows. Our military involvement throughout the world over the last several decades has left some regions dependent on the relative security the United States provides. While this arrangement is not desirable in the long term, we cannot simply retreat immediately from some regions where a rapid exodus would cause further instability. Instead, a deliberate withdrawal is needed to ensure that American allies or clients are not left isolated and at risk by our departure. A reduction in military bases abroad should occur as part of this policy shift, except for those required to protect diplomatic missions or to meet explicit treaty obligations. Now, here we might take Afghanistan as a test case. Comments on this particular point of the plank.
I'm happy to start, if that's okay.
Sure.
Since I just talked, but that was actually a sentiment that I was very strong about having in our platform. And I will come back to Afghanistan, but I'll get there via a little bit of a different path. Having been over there and dealing with locals who do support us and actually see the good that we do try to do when we're over there, I am also well aware of that when we decide that we don't want to play anymore and that it's too hard and walk away, we leave those people in a lurch, and those people are often victimized. And I believe we owe those folks solidarity as well, that we started something in their homes and then we walk away. I think that's an injustice, and that's really what this is getting to. Colin Powell famously said about the war, if you break it, you buy it. And I don't think we have ever really internalized that. My feeling, I'm going to take even a step back to Iraq. Aside from whether Iraq was just or not, just put that on the table because I think that's a debatable point as well. And I'm not a fan. I'm ultimately not a fan of what we did in Iraq. But just put it aside whether it was just or not. Put that aside. There should also be a consideration. And I think this is developing in the just war theory too, because there's the justice in going to war, justice in how you conduct war, and it seems to be we're developing a justice in how you end the war. There needs to be a consideration for what we do after the fact and how we walk away. I would have advised President Bush, had I been in that situation, I would have said, sir, not only do you need a formal declaration of war from Congress, I mean formal, this authorization to use force I don't think should cut it. I think everybody has to acknowledge with very, very explicit language that we are going to war. I would have also gone to the American people and said to them, my fellow Americans, I am proposing that we need to go into Iraq. Here are the reasons why I think we need to go, and make no mistake, we're going to be on a war footing, and you can expect to have to stay there for decades after the war to help clean it up. And if you, the American people, don't believe that we should invest, say, 40 to 50 years of our blood, sweat, and tears to fix that thing we break, then it ain't worth doing, and we need to walk away. That's what I think needs to be done, and I think if we had that acknowledgement, we'd actually avoid war. Now we're in situations where we quickly run away, and I alluded somewhat to Korea, certainly Vietnam, and I'm not getting into the aspects of whether the fight was right. I'm getting into the aspects that we left people hanging. But we leave early. It happened in Iraq when they pulled out, and ISIS was able to reconstitute. We leave it a bigger mess than we found it. And I think we have an obligation to see these things through that we started as adults, as painful as they are, with an eye, though, towards getting out and egressing. The recent situation in Syria was another great example of this. I was not for us getting involved in Syria the way we did, but we did. And then when the president decided he thought pulling out was a good idea, we had just made promises to the Kurds. But we did it again. And, we've also done that to the Kurds before post-Desert Storm. We leave these folks hanging. So that brings me around to Afghanistan. I fear with Afghanistan that we're at a point where we have there's nothing left to be gained there. I'm not sure we can fix what we broke because I'm not sure it was fixed to begin with. One of the interesting things about Afghanistan when I was there was we would build these nice buildings for the locals, for the local governments, and within months, all of the copper had been pulled out of them by the locals, all the copper wiring, so they could sell it. They just would gut the stuff. I remember hearing a story how we built a bit of a highway for them, and some of the locals were upset because now you just made it easier for the warlords to travel by car to come and harass us. Before they had to go over rough terrain. It kept them out of our hair, and so we tend to try to help these guys in ways that are very American. It's like the civil planners get off the planes as soon as hostilities end, and there's a guy with blueprints going, okay, the McDonald's will go here. You're going to want a Walmart here. Let's write your Constitution. Of course, you're going to want to bicameral legislation because everybody wants that. We try to redesign it in our own image, not realizing these folks don't necessarily want that. They don't need it, and we're going to be counterproductive in pushing forward on that. So the problem with Afghanistan now, even with what I said about the long haul, I'm not sure anyone has a plan for a long haul there, and I'm not sure there can be a plan for a long haul there. So I will admit I don't have a good answer for that. It's just a mess. So long-winded, but I give back the floor.
Oh, we are opposed to Soundbytes on this podcast. We encourage the wind if it blows well, so don't worry about that. Let me ask this question next. You want to, I can understand this, you want to say, if we're going to have a war, we ought to be very clear about what's involved in a war, and there's a justice in going to war, a justice in war, and a developing appreciation for a justice in leaving war. And all of this might mean that we have to make a resolve that amounts to, say, a 30-year, 40-year commitment. Do you think the American people can resolve to do anything other than to watch more TV for 30 or 40 years?
Sadly, well, no, yeah, and I'm the American people too, so I got to say this about myself. So I'm not standing in judgment of the rest of my fellow Americans. But yeah, we have a short attention span. But if that a short attention span means we shouldn't be going off into war, then that's what it means. And I think no American, probably if President Bush had laid it out, well, some Americans would, but if President Bush had laid it out the way I said it, I think most people would not have been in favor of the war, and we wouldn't have gone. And that would have been the right answer given our attention span. We're not up for that. And it seems to me that we're probably only really up for it when we feel that our own well-being is completely at stake. Other than that, we've got it so good that we quickly lose interest. And, you know, think about it. That's what President Bush told everyone. And I understand why he did it. He was trying to keep people in a good mindset. But what was the message? Go out, continue to do your shopping, go to your football games, enjoy. The military's got it. Well, that's not really, in the long run, short term, I got it. I understand the pep talk. But in the long run, that's not a good mindset for the American people to have. Because meanwhile, you know, the rest of us in the military are all fighting this thing, and everybody else just quickly forgets about it. And it should be something that's important. So I would say we don't have the attention span for it. Therefore, we shouldn't do it.
There was, along these same lines, there was a good amount of discussion about how, in the context of the military effort in Iraq, that it should be made very clear what's at stake to ordinary people, because most people could go on about their business without paying much attention. And one of the proposals was there ought to be a major hike in gas prices, so that every time anybody bought gas and they wondered why they were spending so much, they would be reminded that they're spending so much because of this war. And then they would think about it much more than they would ordinarily think about it. And that, too, raises in my mind, I actually grew up with I like to say, a generation of orderlies. I was of draftable age during the Vietnam War, and most of my friends were conscientious objectors, as I was. But if there's no draft, then once again, there's a way to insulate everybody who's involved from the rest of the population, or insulate the rest of the population from the relatively few people who volunteered, which makes invisible much of what's actually going on. Now, the next thing I want to say is in a sense, completely off the wall, so be warned. But again and again and again and again, when I listen to politicians in the major parties, I want them to say something like, and unless we, as Americans, change our lives and develop some basic virtues, none of what we propose is going to work. It all depends on virtuous citizens. Now, here's a case that comes to mind because I just discovered it yesterday. In the last year, according to the New York Times, there were, I don't know how they work this out, but this was front page, Sunday New York Times, where they have their more reflective, in-depth articles. Front page, 45 million instances of graphic child abuse and or torture on the internet. Now, I haven't come to terms with that. I had 24 hours. I probably could use 24 months to come to terms with that. But if you have a population which has that kind of grotesque phenomenon, I think any politician who says anything ought to stop and say, and this country of ours has got to have a profound reform of heart and spirit. And that would connect, now if we go from off the wall to back to the court, that would connect with, before we decide to wage war, we ought to take a good long look at who we are.
I don't think anyone can dispute that.
So if I can interject something there, Jim,
Yes.
but I don't think that any other country would be different today. In other words, if you have a survey of the same phenomenon in some, let's say, Latin American country, I don't think there would be much difference. So in other words, you don't have there the ingredients to make that population really virtuous in order to build their own democracy. So that said, lead us to, I think, something is in the platform of the American Solidarity Party. We cannot build democracy from the United States by using force, much less through interventions. So something should come up from the local people, and that come up through the traditional way of building democracy, through citizenry and building through certain principles and certain morality and so on. And that cannot come from the top down rather than the bottom up. So in some ways, not interventionist policies, or at least use of power, soft power, is much better approach, I think, that just intervening in those situations and try to build democracy by fiat or by force.
Could you, and I was tempted to raise this question earlier on, could you say a little bit about what soft power refers to?
Jeffrey? Sorry. There are degrees of what we'll call soft power, because my problem also with some of the things that fall into soft power, those aren't necessarily, they're soft in that we're not dropping bombs on people, but we're using things like sanctions and economic means to convince people, with quote marks around that, convince them to change their way of doing things or to go along with the way that we want to do things. I'm not so sure those things are useful either. And I'm not saying there's not a place for them at times. There certainly is. I would like to see softer power be a lot more about leadership, setting the example, and sometimes setting some hard examples with some countries that traditionally have been allied with us, but taking a stronger stand with them on some of their human rights issues. And I think that if we really want to use the softest power, which is, again, leadership by example, that's going to go back to us exhibiting some of that virtue, Mr. Hanink, that you're talking about, and doing some things that are difficult but right. But if we're not doing that in our own daily lives, I don't think it's realistic to expect our leadership, our political leadership, to do it in their lives. Just to put a capstone on that, we don't have the leadership. The leadership doesn't cause us to change. We have our current leadership because it reflects us. The only people we have to blame for our political leadership is ourselves, because we in our own lives are not living in accordance with all the right and just things ourselves.
Let me offer another test case. This is a big case and a big test. We have China, and they're about to celebrate tomorrow National Day. And there have been some comments from some of our leadership. I think that Vice President Pence has, at least on occasion, addressed this problem. We have, as far as I can tell from what I read, we have a country that has 1 million plus people in re-education camps. And it's a religious minority, the Muslims, the Uyghurs in particular, but it's spread. The people in areas adjacent to the location of the preponderance of the Uyghurs. 1 million people in re-education camps with the most laughable lies told about the nature of those camps. It seems to me that we have 95% of our coverage of the United States and China addressing economic questions, trade war in particular. And yet we have this profound violation of human rights. And to add insult to injury, we have, and I make a sharp distinction between what the Church teaches and Vatican diplomatic policies. I make a very sharp distinction. We have a much touted, although secret, what could I call it, protocol worked out with the Chinese government for some sort of alleged freedom in the church without any reference to this whatsoever. It's just extraordinary, and that seems to me to be another manifestation of central political issues, United States-Chinese relations, that pretty much ignore the most central question. Now, what's a little party like us supposed to do about something like that? Listeners are calling in. I have to turn my attention to the phones.
Yeah, but in 5 minutes, I'll tell you how to solve the China problem. Stand by. Here you
right.
Go. No,
I'm
not.
But the imbalance and the whole orientation towards it is just staggering. And it is a matter of foreign policy.
It is, but at the end of the day, they make stuff for us, right? And we like our stuff. I mean, I'm sitting here talking to you on my iPhone, which was probably made in China, right? So I don't know how you divorce that quickly, because there's going to be lots of people that would be upset with disrupting the chain of stuff that comes our way. Nevertheless, I think you got to advocate that it needs to be done. They need to be called out for their transgressions, but not to a point. I mean, this is where I get to, like, understanding the other cultures. I can call them out on it, and I can start to put pressure on them, and I can lead by example and be that, that the United States is, a shining hill or a shining city on the hill type thing. But I can't do it to the point where I shut them off. I have to engage them somewhat. An example might be of, I'll bring it around to the military again. That in the Navy,
because we need to be in a lot of places at once.
Yeah, and sometimes part of that being in places, there's a difference between being there to shoot them up, but there's a thing that the Navy used to refer to, well, we still do, but we would just call it presence. It was just there. Now, for a Navy, that's very important because traditionally we would be out showing the flag so that any of our merchant vessels, to provide protection for there, to show other folks that we care about them. And that goes back to way long ago. I mean, like Barbary Pirates type time, right? So we show the flag for that. But one of the aspects of presence also was engagement with foreign nations. And now we haven't always done that well, but I will say that in the modern era, we often do exercises with foreign countries. And it's not just the Navy, it's just the Navy does a lot of it. The Navy Marine Corps does a lot of it just by the nature of our going to sea. And we would engage with these countries, and we would do, some minimal type of joint training exercises and things like that. And often some of these exercises, we don't get anything out of them from the U.S. point of view. But these countries that we engage, they do get some good training out of it. But what they also get is they get some engagement with Americans. And sometimes that engagement is just completely social. But there's other times when that engagement is it's more of a philosophical nature, where these countries see that as an officer, no, I don't. I defer to my civilian leadership because that's the way things are. Or I respect the people I serve. I'm here to serve the American people. It's not the other way around. They're not here to provide for me. That sort of influence does happen, and it needs to continue to happen. And I think these are the ways that we start to influence countries like China or even Iran. I don't think with the Iran situation, I wasn't a fan of the nuclear agreement, but we made it, and I think because we made it, we should have stuck to it. But I was more of a fan of, look, let's not try to bite the entire apple at once. We need to just start doing things with Iran down at the local level. Let's just have soccer games with them, things like that. I know that might sound very trite to people or simplistic, but I think that's the level you have to start building trust upon and engage these folks at the lower level and start to realize that maybe your disagreements aren't that far apart, and maybe we can influence them with a different way of thinking that pushes them in the right direction. But I will say, even with that point, Mr. Hanink, I go back to your point a little bit ago. We have to have our own house in order, and if we don't have our own house in order, we can come across as being hypocritical.
I have an anecdote that connects with your idea of what you might call grandiloquently cultural exchange. Once upon a time, back when I was a wage slave at Loyola Marymount University, we had in the philosophy department a colleague whose alma mater was University of Beijing. and she was at the time in her 40s, so she remembered some of the very bad old days. Now, we had a decision to make in the department about a new hire, and those are the decisions that caused a lot of dissension. You were talking about everybody having his own agenda. Well, in a philosophy department, everybody has an idea of what philosophy really is, which is shared by nobody else. And so the idea, if you're going to hire somebody, you want to hire somebody who has your own unique view of what philosophy is. Well, at any rate, we were undecided. We had the vote, 5-5. Well, how about pairing off these two candidates? 5-5. Let's have another vote. And after about 6 or 7 votes, the colleague from the University of Beijing said, "Vote again?" She was just floored that we were going to continue to vote, just absolutely amazed at the prospect of still more votes. I was nauseated, but I wasn't surprised. Oh well, that's an anecdote from my own background. Well, all right then. Let me raise a different question, and in a way it connects with the bulk of what we've been speaking of. We have this preamble to the plank, which is, I think, extremely constructive. But then the first bullet point is this, the very first. We looked at the fifth bullet point about really withdrawal from involvements. The first bullet point says, just war theory is the foundation of moral foreign policy. Now, we've spoken a lot about war and the way that war is carried out, and the bullet point continues. It means that war should always serve as a last resort against grave acts of aggression and must be undertaken with clear goals and due regard for unintended consequences. Conduct of war must be governed by norms of proportionality and respect for human life. But it is startling, I think, and I think this is a mistake, too, to say that just war theory is the foundation of moral foreign policy. It seems like the foundation ought to be more in terms of what we can do to help people in constructive ways, rather than the foundation of the policy is what we do as a last resort. Now, I think the not taking seriously just war theory has been a profound problem in our foreign policy, but certainly theory of war isn't the foundation of foreign policy. That's something that comes later, wouldn't you say?
I think you bring up a good point there. You could say justice should always be the foundation of everything. I would equate that sentiment probably speaks more to the fact that we have been at arms for such a long time in this nation that was probably on our brains a bit.
Yeah. And as I say, the preamble, if you want to call it that, is very positive and constructive. Mario, please bring us some more Latin American insights.
Well, I have been thinking about the policy in China. And if I remember well, the claim that I heard many times was that if we engage with them in a trade and give them the most favorable status to the Chinese, then they are going to engage in capitalism, free market. They are going to bring wealth to their country, and when you bring wealth, people want to participate in political system, and so after that, democracy will happen. I heard many times after the end of the Cold War that claim, so to justify the trade with China, and so, but after 20-some years, the result has been perhaps not quite good, and so they have strengthened their economic apparatus, but as you see in Hong Kong, there is nowhere to be found what we call traditionally democracy. So my point is that it's unclear to me what would be the best approach in foreign policy to a system like this, which is totalitarian. Now, in the long run, here from 25 years from now, probably will work if we deal with them in some cultural agreement and we play soccer with them and so on. We can somehow, in the long run, by transmitting our values to them. But during this year, it seems that policy didn't work well. And let me just go back to a comparison in Latin America after the 1960s, where the influence of the Soviet Union through the Soviet bloc was very substantial through Cuba. And they proposed, or they even imposed revolution all across the continent. The United States, yes, was engaged in the Cold War as well, supporting some military dictatorship, but at the same time, coming from the Kennedy administration came a policy which was a little bit different, which was the line for progress, which meant that in order to somehow prevent this revolution from the people being helped by the Soviet Union, they proposed some engagement and agreements and working in commerce and intercultural exchanges and education exchanges with all the states in Latin America. And that program, I think, was in many ways a success in some places. In other words, some countries began building their own democracies thanks to these exchanges. Now, I think that is a mixed result because at the same time also there was some confrontation with some military junta. So my point is that not always, it seems, historically speaking, the exchanges in habit, way of living will work. At least they don't work in the long.
So there are programs and there are strategies that have really been effective and fruitful.
Yeah, but it's back to playing the long game again, and I think that's what we seem to have come to the conclusion that we like to play the short game here in the States.
That's right.
Let me look at, we're coming to the end of the hour, and I look at all the bullet points, and we've talked about two. One more bullet point, and it's okay if we go over a little bit. It's the seventh bullet point in the plank on foreign policy. Nuclear weapons signal a failure to create a world that values peace over warfare. Our nation must lead the effort to rid the world of these terrible weapons through the use of arms control initiatives, non-proliferation treaties, and we're doing so to not diminish national security, unilateral steps to reduce our nuclear weapon stockpiles. In particular, the United States should rejoin the Iran nuclear deal and should negotiate an update to the lapsed intermediate-range nuclear forces treaty with Russia. Further, as a nation, we should reject first use of nuclear weapons and should not seek first strike capabilities. Jeffrey, would you like to highlight or lowlight some of the aspects of that bullet?
Sure, because I was my hand was very strong in writing those words. So yeah, I've never liked nuclear weapons. Certainly, I've been trained to use them. My beef with them is they're indiscriminate. They are not they're not an honorable means of fighting. Now, I don't. I think the U.S. use of nuclear weapons in World War II was wrong. However, I am not one of these people that I'm gonna damn the president to hell for it or anything like that. I wasn't in his shoes. Thank God I wasn't in a position to have to make that call. I'm saying it now, sitting where I am. But I will say this: that even when that decision was made, Admiral King, Admiral Leahy, General MacArthur, Admiral Nimitz, General Eisenhower, they were all against the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. They did not feel it was needed, nor did they feel it was justified. In fact, Admiral King was very adamant that he was not taught to wage war on innocent civilians. He was a man at arms. He would only go after other people who were under arms. Now, I will say, some people will bring up the fact that MacArthur wanted to use tactical nukes in Korea. That is true. He wanted to use small nukes that could be targeted strictly against, at least in his mind, against the enemy combatants. So it's always an issue of the weapons not discriminating enough to get the target. At least in my mind, from a Navy standpoint, I never minded the notion of using a nuke on, say, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine at sea, and I could use a nuke to take that out because it was going to launch nukes. It didn't bother me because we're not blowing up a city. But good grief, these weapons just have the potential for doing so much harm and getting out of hand that we should, as the U.S., be leading the world in trying to get rid of them and downplay them. I mean, I understand the cat's out of the bag to some extent. But technology usually trumps things like this, and we should be trying to get rid of them while developing means to combat against them if folks try to use them, in a way to neutralize them, rather than having to still rely upon the effective but insane notion of mutual assured destruction. That is a notion that I do believe works. Folks know that if they lob a nuke, that odds are they're going to get hit in kind and not in a good way. But, man, who wants to live like that? I certainly don't. And also the cost for these things is outrageous. That would be resources better spent elsewhere. So I would love to see our party continue to push the notion of getting rid of nuclear arms, and we should lead the way. I'm not a fan of just unilaterally getting rid of all of ours, but I have no problem with the notion of unilaterally starting to reduce ours as a gesture and to show that, we only need enough to maintain a deterrence. I don't need enough to wipe you out 18 times, because at that point, what is the point?
Very sober thoughts, very sober. Well, we are at the end of our hour, and I hesitate to go to another bullet point because any one of them could lead us to another hour, and there's no reason why we can't come back on another podcast to this plank. We are going to come back to the education plank. We already have someone who wants to revisit that discussion, somebody who's been a teacher for a long time at the elementary level. And I think that when you reflect on education, it really helps to have a from the beginning to the end, which is no end at all, overview. Let's end then, as we usually do, with the gospel of today's liturgy. And this is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9. An argument arose among the disciples about which of them was the greatest. Jesus realized the intention of their hearts and took a child and placed it by his side and said to them, "Whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. For the one who is least among all of you is the one who is the greatest." Then John said in reply, "Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he does not follow in our company." Jesus said to him, "Do not prevent him, for whoever is not against you is for you." The Gospel of the Lord. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
And thanks always to Mario Ramos y Reyes, and we'll have a new podcast next week. God bless all.
Sir.
Godspeed. Take care.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.